Of all the fun and interesting differences between English dialects, I think one of my favourite is the differences between how people pronounce the sound that's represented in writing with the letter R. And before we get started, it's important to remember that we're talking about the sound here and not the letter. So the history of the actual shape of the letter and how it's used across European languages isn't necessarily relevant. We're talking about the sound in pronunciation. So even though it might seem obvious, just for the sake of having a phonetic definition of this, I put something up on screen. We're talking about the phoneme that people use at the starts of words like rabbit and red. In modern English alone, there are 6 or 7 common ways of pronouncing this sound, and I'll describe them each in a bit of detail, but if that's boring you can skip to the time shown on screen and I'll have moved on to something more interesting. The alveolar approximant R is made with the tip of the tongue almost but not quite touching the alveolar ridge, which is the ridge just above the gum line. On its own this sounds like R, R, but in English it's very often pronounced with rounded lips, R, R. In some dialects you have a version of this sound where the body of the tongue is also drawn back to the soft palate, R, R. In other dialects, the tongue is bunched up in a way that I find quite difficult to do, so I won't try it here, but phoneticians like John Wells have commented that it sounds basically the same as the unbunched r that I use. Other dialects use a retroflex version of the sound, where the tip of the tongue is near the alveolar ridge, but curled back on itself. R, r. Other dialects still use an alveolar tap, where the tongue actually comes into contact with the alveolar ridge, or sort of taps it on the way past. Era, era. Some dialects use an alveolar trill, where you hold the body of the tongue still and blow air past the tip of the tongue so it vibrates back and forth against the alveolar ridge. Ra, ra. I think this is what most people mean when they talk about a rolled R. And finally, some dialects use a labiodental approximant, where the bottom lip almost touches the top teeth and air is blown through the resulting gap. Ra, ra, ra. In some dialects this is considered a speech impediment, so most speakers don't have it. In other dialects it's just the normal way of pronouncing the sound. R, r. These sounds are in regular correspondence across dialects, so although it might sound obvious, just to reinforce the idea that we're talking about sounds rather than letters, where one dialect might have a r, another dialect might have r, another dialect might have r. That's what I mean by regular correspondence across dialects. And conveniently that it normally patterns with where the letter R is in spelling, although I'm just trying to cement that we're talking about sounds rather than letters. So how do we interpret this scattering of different pronunciations? Were they distributed differently 500 years ago? Do they all ultimately come from one kind of sound that then diverged into several kinds of sound over time? So for example, did everyone trill their R's 1,000 years ago and then local areas started developing their own weird pronunciations? In this video we'll look at the evidence starting from early on. The furthest back in time that you can make reasoned arguments is probably Proto-Germanic, which is the common ancestor of English, German, Dutch, Norwegian, Swedish, Gothic, and various other languages. I'll put a family tree on screen so you can kind of visualise it. Proto-Germanic was spoken in Scandinavia during the Iron Age, and in most reconstructions of Proto-Germanic that I've heard, people assume an alveolar trill, ra, and I think that's mostly because it's the most common of these sounds across European languages nowadays, and you can easily explain a change from ra to any of the modern sounds, so it makes sense that this was the ancestor that all the rest of these sounds came from. But we don't know that for certain. Across modern Germanic languages in continental Europe, you have examples of uvular pronunciations of R, with the body of the tongue drawn back towards the throat. Ra, ra. These are found in German and Swedish and Norwegian. Pretty much everywhere in continental Europe you have pockets of people that use this sound. And in fact in German I think it's the most common sound. It's the sound that's used in standard German. Is it possible that this was the sound in the Iron Age in Proto-Germanic and that it developed into the range of sounds that we now see in English? Could the original sound have been ra and then that turned into ra and so forth? To try to get to the bottom of this, we'll need to explore the history of ra in German. Some early historical linguists assume that the ra sound originally developed in French, and that Germans in certain cities then borrowed it from French and it spread north from there. These linguists believed that the ra, the trill, must be the original rhotic sound in German, and that belief seems to be based on the idea that it's somehow stronger than ra, which is obviously not a very scientific way of thinking about it. There's some evidence that the uvular pronunciation ra was at least common in some dialects of German as early as the 1500s. Jacob Boehmer said that the sound was trilled and made with the tongue drawn back into the mouth and not stretched forward. Spelling evidence pushes this even further back in time. Bavarian texts from the 1300s often have the spelling RCH, where modern standard German would just have R. In German, CH normally represents a back fricative sound like ch, so this might be somebody's way of representing a uvular r sound, which is back but also rhotic. A lot of the research I'm talking about was done by Richard Runge in the 1970s, and contrary to the maybe the common idea that the uvular r pronunciation started off in French and then spread to German and spread northwards, he suggests that it might actually come from German and it might have spread to French urban dialects later on. As we've seen, there's written evidence of uvular r much earlier in German than there is in French, but it's also distributed across Germany in a way that suggests it's not a recent development. If it was a recent development, you'd expect it to look like it was kind of radiating out from particular central points, probably urban centres, with rural areas having more conservative pronunciations like r. But we don't see this kind of pattern in Germanic-speaking Europe. There are plenty of rural areas that seem to have used r for ages, and there are urban areas that use r. Whereas in French, r radiates a bit more around cities. So this uvular pronunciation is quite old in Continental Germanic languages, so is it possible that it was actually the rhotic consonant of Proto-Germanic back in the Iron Age? Runge argues that this is possible, based on the way the sound developed into the medieval Germanic languages, and I think his argument's fairly convincing. In modern languages, consonants often have an effect on the vowels that are near them. For example, the w consonant is pronounced with rounded lips, and so if you're talking quickly and you say a word like with or win, the lip rounding from the w will often end up spilling over into the I. With, win. Over time, this can lead to fairly large changes in the pronunciation of certain vowels. This kind of thing seems to have happened while Proto-Germanic was developing into Old English. Certain early Old English vowels changed in certain environments. Specifically, the vowels pronounced at the front of the mouth, I, E, and A, became diphthongs, where the tongue glides from the front to the back of the mouth. I became iu, E became eo, A became a. This sound change affected these vowels wherever they occurred before the sounds w or ch. So, ich became iuch, ech became euch, ach became ach. The sound change also occurred before an L sound if it was then followed by another consonant, or before an R sound if it was then followed by another consonant. So the early Old English word sach becomes salch. We're very confident that both these sounds in Old English were pronounced with the body of the tongue drawn back into the mouth. So, w, ch. And that makes a lot of sense. It seems like this sound change is causing front vowels to change so that the tongue glides back into the mouth to articulate the back consonant while you're pronouncing the vowel. So, to think of it another way, the backness of the back consonant has spilled over into the way that the vowel is pronounced. Normally, a is pronounced with the tongue at the front of the mouth, and ch is pronounced with the tongue at the back of the mouth. So in going from a to ch, you have to draw your tongue towards the back of the mouth. So in quick speech, people were probably doing that tongue movement from the front to the back of the mouth while they were saying the vowel. So ach becomes ach. This falls in line with how sound change works in modern languages, so it's not unusual at all. What's interesting is that the L and R phonemes also trigger the vowels to change in this way, but only if they're then followed by another consonant. This signals something to historical linguists. It signals that these phonemes might have been pronounced with the tongue towards the back of the mouth, but only if they were then followed by another consonant. That might sound strange, but it's similar to what happens with the L phoneme in my dialect of English. If it's followed by a vowel, it's just plain L with the tongue at the alveolar ridge. But if it's followed by a consonant, or it's at the end of a word, it's pronounced with the tip of the tongue at the alveolar ridge and the body of the tongue pulled back and up to the soft palate. All. You can hear the difference. All. I say lilt, lisp, pull. A similar situation probably existed in early Old English. The L phoneme had an allophone at the front of the mouth which was used before vowels, like in the word luft, and an allophone with a more back articulation which was used before consonants, like in the word ouch. So it stands to reason that the same kind of thing might have been true of the R phoneme. Before vowels, and maybe before gaps in speech, it could be a front consonant like r, and before consonants it could have some kind of back articulation. Maybe this was a completely uvular sound like in German, r, or maybe it was similar to my ul sound in that part of the tongue was at the front of the mouth and part of the tongue was at the back, and that's what I often see in reconstructions of velarized alveolar trill. R, r. This is an example of the kind of inference you can make based on evidence from historical sound changes. As you can see, we can't be that confident about the exact phonetic quality of the sound this far back in time. As far as I know, evidence through the Middle English period is very scarce, although there was an interesting sound change that happened in certain parts of the country that's worth mentioning here. The rhotic consonants started to disappear entirely in certain words, particularly words that ended with rhotic and then s. So if we assume it's a trill for the sake of argument, ars becomes as and bars becomes bas. This may have happened in one single jump, the r just disappearing, or it may have gone through an intermediate stage where, for example, the r sound was gone, but then the s sound was pronounced retroflex to compensate for it, and after a while the s stopped being retroflex and all trace of the r was gone. So, bars, bas, bas. The bas pronunciation of this word is now standard across major English dialects. As we get into the 1600s, we start to get a lot more useful data about how this phoneme was pronounced, especially around London, because that's where a lot of people, that's where a lot of phoneticians were writing about it. Almost everyone that gives an explicit description of it describes it as an alveolar trill, ra. Alex Foreman goes into a much more detailed elaboration on his blog, which I'm going to link in the description, but phoneticians from William Holder to Isaac Newton give very clear descriptions of the body of the tongue being held in place and the airflow being directed across the top of it so it vibrates. That's pretty much as clear as any modern description of r. Combined with all the rest of reconstructed English phonology from back then, we have red, regal, radish. These descriptions are all by people of fairly high status or in some position of academic authority, so they're probably describing the way fairly upper-class people spoke. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody was using this trill sound in the 1600s. Poorer people might have been using r or something similar. But it's just as possible that poorer people were using a trill as well, r. Even though it might sound posh to modern ears, it doesn't require any special education to produce a trill. You just sort of pick it up when you're a child if that's the sound everyone else is using. So there's no reason why ordinary people couldn't have been using it. Because poorer people didn't tend to write pronunciation textbooks, our view is obviously going to be biased in favour of richer or more academic people. But anyway, somewhere along the way between the 1600s and modern English, the trill r had to give way to the modern approximant r. So how did this happen? Evidence from London comes from as far back as the 1600s. The playwright Ben Jonson wrote that the R sound was sounded firm in the beginning of words and more liquid in the middle and ends. And obviously the word liquid is kind of impressionistic. You could interpret it a few ways. It's very important to use a lot of caution when interpreting words like this, because the way we understand them now isn't necessarily the way somebody writing 500 years ago meant them. So with that word of caution in mind, one way you could read this is that people use a trill r at the starts of words and an approximant r in other positions in the word. The approximant sound r could be heard as more liquid than a trill because its acoustic quality stays the same, r, rather than having a lot of turbulence and juddering back and forth, r. Again, that's a modern reading of a difficult to interpret comment, and it's not particularly rigorous or scientific, so take it with a pinch of salt, although it does resemble a system used by many Dutch speakers who have r at the starts of syllables and r at the ends. But a couple of historical linguists and Alex Foreman have pointed out Johnson's description seems to have been plagiarised from a French writer, so it may or may not actually apply to English at the time. I personally think he probably used the description because it kind of reflected how he pronounced his English, so I'm happy to accept r at the starts of word and something like in other positions, but that does deflate the excitement of the evidence a little bit. But the evidence for a trill in the 1600s is very interesting indeed. So what happened in London after the 1600s? In the mid-1700s, you start getting descriptions of a very interesting phenomenon. Flint tells us that if R comes before a consonant, it's so soft that it's almost inaudible, and it slightly lengthens the vowel before it. So the word starting would be an example of a word where the rhotic comes before a consonant. In the 1600s, we'd expect something like starting, or if we accept Johnson's description, starting. What could Flint mean by saying that the rhotic is soft? Well, if it was an approximant as Johnson suggests, this could just mean that the tip of the tongue doesn't get as close to the alveolar ridge, so the like quality of the sound doesn't come across quite as much. Starting. 20 or 30 years later, it seems to have become fairly normal for the sound to disappear or almost disappear before consonants. Bear in mind this is probably still very restricted to London, and it seems to have been a matter of disagreement whether people considered it proper English or not. John Walker says that some Londoners sometimes completely drop but that in proper speech it should always be pronounced and it's never silent. So this shows us a kind of flipped version of the modern perception. Card is deemed to be more proper pronunciation, card is deemed vulgar. Start is proper, start is vulgar. This is a good time to bring up a point I've made before. I've seen a few people comment that upper-class British English pronunciation was somehow invented in the 17 or 1800s to sound posh and distinguish people from the working class, but many features that are now characteristic of upper-class British English pronunciation actually started off as features of lower-class speech. It seems like dropping before a consonant might be one of those features. It appears in London as a fairly restricted feature and ends up becoming part of the standard. Of course, it's not necessarily that simple. Many phoneticians in London were clearly not pronouncing before consonants, but were presumably fairly well educated if they were publishing books, so it seems like it was becoming a feature of normal upper-class speech in London, and that some people just disapproved of it anyway. Some of the phoneticians mention that there's a kind of trace of an sound still present, and again you could interpret that in various ways, but we're now drawing so close to the age of modern audio recording that we can be more confident about what this means. Since the start of audio recording in the late 1800s, both upper and lower class London accents have not pronounced before a consonant, but even though the isn't there anymore, it does leave a trace. This word was pronounced something like feared by a 19th century RP speaker. You'll notice that there's no longer any sound. It wasn't feared, but the tongue does retract towards the centre of the mouth before the consonant. It wasn't generally feared, as it might be in my accent, it was feared. Ear, and this off-glide might be what people were talking about when they said that there was a trace of a r sound left. There's no rhotic consonant anymore, but the vowel does still have an echo of it. Feared. So between about 1650 and 1800, it seems like there was a progression something like air. So what's the situation been in London since audio recording was invented? Well, for most English speakers in London, can only occur before vowels. It never occurs before a consonant or a break in speech, and this is probably a continuation of what was happening before audio recording. In the mid-1700s, disappeared if it came before a consonant, and somewhere along the line it also disappeared if it came before a gap in speech. In the late 1800s, both upper and lower class speakers in London still had a kind of central vowel or glide as an echo where the sound used to be. For upper class speakers, the tongue was slightly higher, here, there. For lower class speakers, the tongue was slightly lower, here, there. We now call this kind of dialect non-rhotic because the rhotic sound disappears in certain environments. But it's not completely disappeared. Like I said, in upper-class London speech, the sound didn't appear before a consonant or a pause in speech. So in the word walker, bird, here, You can't hear a r. It's not walker, bird, here. It's walker, bird, here. But this rule worked across word boundaries. In other words, if the word walker was immediately followed by a word starting in a vowel, this historical sound reappeared. Walker on its own doesn't have at the end, but if you said the walker is in the street, then you would pronounce the r. The walker is in the street. This also happened when the word took a grammatical ending that started with a vowel. Here has no but hearing has one. This was called linking r because the historical r sound appeared again when it was needed to link together two vowels. In working class London dialects of the 1800s and possibly earlier, this linking r phenomenon started to spread even to words where there hadn't been a r sound historically. This person writing the late 1800s uses an example of the place name Maida Hill. Cockney speakers dropped the h in hill so that it started with a vowel when they pronounced it, like ill, and this triggered the linking r in the word Maida, so the place name was pronounced Maida Ill, even though there was no r phoneme there historically. Because there was no r phoneme there historically, this extension of the rule was called intrusive r, and it seems like people considered it a sign of poor education. I suppose the idea was that somebody would only use intrusive r if they weren't very good at spelling and didn't know which words were supposed to have r in them and which ones weren't. But over the 1900s, this intrusive r became very widespread, and I'm sure that most southeastern British English speakers now have it as standard, including me. Dr. Jeff Lindsay has a video that describes some of the properties of this linking r, but I'll normally have it in sentences like, America isn't a small country, or Queen Victoria ate a lemon. America isn't a small country, Queen Victoria ate a lemon. This even happens when you add suffixes to words that end in these vowels, so for me, soaring and soaring are homophones. I would never say sawing in the course of normal speech. It's not that I think there's meant to be an r in these words. I'd never accidentally spell them with an r. That's just how my dialect deals with situations where these two vowels would otherwise come into contact with each other. Again, Jeff's video covers this in more detail. So around London, the distribution of the r sound started off fairly typical for European languages, became increasingly complicated through the early modern period, and now it has a typologically unusual distribution with this linking r thing. Regardless of the weird distributional thing with the linking r, until very recently there were a few ways of pronouncing the r phoneme in the southeast in positions where it was still pronounced. There's recordings of southeastern British people with trilled pronunciations like r,
with the seats going parallel with the bass.
Some people used a tap between vowels and an approximant in other positions, era, era.
I don't like them very much.
Others just use a labialised approximant like I do, r. And that's certainly been the most common in the southeast over the last 70 years at least, probably longer. And some people, particularly working class Londoners, use this labiodental approximant, r.
In this grave hour.
I discussed in my video on RP and Cockney English that the labiodental r was probably scattered across both upper and lower class London English in the late 1800s, but it's hard to tell how early it first appeared. So that's the r sound in the urban southeast of England. That's only a tiny part of the English-speaking world. Until very recently, a huge number of regional dialects were still rhotic, pronouncing the r in all positions where it appeared historically, and using some kind of approximant.
The first job I had, shepherding.
Well, some will say I left when I was 13, some will tell me I was 14. I thought it was 14, but...
Oh, it's easier. Easier now, isn't it?
In fact, this was probably the norm throughout huge swathes of southern England in the late 1800s, although it's more recently become mostly confined to the West Country. Irish English is also still largely rhotic, and so are most dialects of American English, which makes sense. Rhoticity was the norm at the time the first British people travelled to North America.
I'm Old Norse Specialist Jackson Crawford.
Again, North American dialects can use various kinds of approximant, but there are groups of people in the US who speak non-rhotically, only pronouncing the R when a vowel comes afterwards. So most famously this occurs in urban centres on the East Coast like New York and Boston, but it also occurs in certain places in the southern US, and historically a lot of African American speech has been non-rhotic, although I think more recently non-rhoticity in the US has been getting rarer and rarer in all these groups.
In a decade of hope and fear,
numbers,
I started to work on it. I was about 5 years old when
So if most early British migrants to the US spoke rhotically, then where did these pockets of non-rhoticity come from? One thing that characterises a lot of US non-rhotic dialects is that instead of having a very central off-glide like RP, near, square, they have quite a high off-glide, nice, force. This makes perfect sense. This off-glide probably developed from an alveolar approximant, at some point in history, and an alveolar approximant is just a few millimetres away from being a high vowel. You don't have to move your tongue much to go from to e, So it's very easy to go from star, nurse, force, to star, nice, force. It could be that this was actually the first step to non-rhoticity in southern England, that in the mid-1700s Londoners were saying star, nice, force, and then the off-glide became more central as time went on, and the New York and Boston pronunciation preserved the first stage. Because of the tongue position of the off-glide in Boston and New York English, which is high and near the alveolar ridge, I think this is definitely a possibility, although there's not any positive evidence one way or the other. Australian, South African, and a lot of New Zealand English are non-rhotic and function similarly to southeastern British English, presumably because they diverged from British English later, and of all of the dialects that the colonists were speaking, the non-rhotic ones won out. A point of interest here is Northern English and Scottish dialects. Throughout Northern England and Scotland, historically and to this day, there are some interesting realisations of the R phoneme. The most straightforward is the alveolar tap, era, which is used more extensively in the north of England, and then as you go into Scotland you see systems where a tap, era, and the trill, era, are basically interchangeable with each other. The sound changes of southern England are starting to creep further north, so you'll hear many younger Scottish speakers about my age speaking rhotically, but using some kind of approximant like star, nurse. I think the singer from Biffy Clyro and the actress Karen Gillan are examples of speakers who do this.
Turn out to be.
In Northern England, most speakers, young or old, now talk non-rhotically as a result of southern influence. Famously, there is a pocket of Lancashire where people still speak pretty much rhotically, with an approximant that's sometimes so lax that it's almost a vowel. I used to live in this bit of Lancashire, and most of the people I met who did this were older than 40, although there are a few people my own age who did it.
My first job, I went to farm work.
I said in my video on Scouse English that not all of Lancashire speaks rhotically now, and not all of Lancashire spoke rhotically in the past. Because rhoticity is a conservative feature for a dialect to have, in other words it's retaining the older system with R pronounced in all positions, it seems likely that if there's a pocket of rhoticity there now, it's always been there. Anecdotally, there are speakers in Cumbria and presumably other parts of the north of England who speak partially rhotically outside of Lancashire. So my grandfather, who was born in 1936, uses an alveolar tap as his rhotic most of the time. Sometimes he uses an approximant r. At the end, so the tap never appears before a consonant, so the word hard would never have a tap in it. But at the end of a word, it may be absent, it may be a voiced alveolar tap, or it may be a voiceless alveolar tap. At the end of a word, it's never the approximant. So a word like water might be pronounced water with a voiced tap. It might be water with a voiceless tap, which is probably the most common for him, or it might be water with no tap at all. This lines up with early descriptions of non-rhoticity in the south of England, where people usually use example words where R has disappeared before a consonant and not at the end of a word. Taps are still relatively common in the north of England, and they're normal in Liverpool and the surrounding areas, like I said. In Scotland, completely rhotic speech with taps and trills is still widespread. But some Scottish people, and historically some English people, have used very interesting rhotics indeed. The Northumbrian Bur is a very well-recorded feature of rural northeastern speech from the 19th and 20th centuries, where people pronounce the rhotic as a labialized uvular fricative, r, r. This was often paired with rhoticity, so people used this sound at the starts and ends of words and before consonants. So listen to this recording.
In the run of straight to the same hole.
Because this pronunciation is so geographically isolated, normally I'd just say it's probably a weird innovation that popped up in a few villages and didn't exist across the whole of northern England, you know, it's just a local Northumbrian thing. But back realisations of the R phoneme are also found in Scotland. I normally use the example of comedian Kevin Bridges here, but the comedian Limmy also pronounces R in a really interesting way in some environments. I've spent ages trying to work out what they're even doing with their tongues here, but the YouTube channel Echo actually has a very helpful Limmy clip which they really narrowly transcribe in IPA phonetic transcription, and they have it that where the R phoneme appears at the end of a syllable in Limmy's accent, there's no rhotic consonant, but the vowel before the R phoneme is pharyngealised. So in the word heavier, the word ends with a pharyngealised central vowel, oh.
What's heavier?
He does the same thing in the word feathers.
Or a kilogram of feathers?
This seems to happen particularly around Glasgow, which is where Limmy and Kevin Bridges are both from. And this situation is a lot more reminiscent of the Old English situation, where you had a front sound in some positions and a back sound in others. So Limmy definitely uses alveolar taps, era, before vowels, but in other environments he does this pharyngealisation thing. So I think that's something that could easily have developed from the Old English system. The Northumbrian Bur remains a bit of an outlier, so I personally think this has probably just sprung up on its own. Maybe it developed from the Old English system where it started off with velarised or uvularised R in certain positions, then that spread so that people always said the R phoneme like that in all environments, even before a vowel. But that doesn't tell us how far back in time Northumbrians would be saying wed. A lot of the time dialectal features like this don't show up in historical records because people were more interested in the standard language than they were in regional dialects, but in this case we're quite lucky. In 1724, Daniel Defoe wrote, "I must not quit Northumberland without taking notice that the natives of this country are distinguished by a shibboleth upon their tongues in pronouncing the letter R, which they cannot utter without a hollow jarring in the throat." He says that Northumbrians consider this a sign of the antiquity of their blood. So this tells us that the uvular R probably did exist in Northumberland back then, and that it was probably still quite local to Northumberland and not a northern feature in general. So hopefully you can see why I like the R phoneme so much. There's a lot of evidence of how it was pronounced historically. There are very explicit descriptions of it, both in the north and in the south, from hundreds of years ago, and in modern English it's pronounced very variably from dialect to dialect. So yeah, hopefully I've presented the case for it as an interesting phoneme, and you don't mind the fact that this video is quite long, which is why it's taken so long to make. I will talk to you very soon. Thank you very much for watching.